Hello, and welcome back to Insufferable Experts. This week, we're talking about the founder marriage. We call this the founder marriage because in order to decide whether or not you want to start a company with somebody, you basically have to treat it like a platonic marriage. And unlike in romantic settings, you can't really go on a date with your potential co-founder. So, what should you be looking at to decide whether or not you want to start a company with somebody? This week, we are going to be discussing three things that we think are critically important. It is not an exhaustive list, it is just a few of them. So this week, it's vision for the company, roles, talents, and responsibilities, and we're going to briefly touch on fundraising, but discuss that in much greater detail in a later episode. Tyler?
Cool. So the first thing that we wanted to touch on today is around vision for the company. So what are your goals? What do you want an exit to look like? How do you perceive this company operating now and into the future? We're going to touch on a couple of different topics here related to money, ownership, and a couple of other things. But I want to start out with talking about an experience that Kaylan and I had when we were actually a couple months into the company, and something
For
that
everybody's context, Tyler and I are co-founders, just to remind you. So you have a resident marriage on deck.
So we may be unpacking some stuff this episode that we didn't think was going to happen. But I was speaking with a mentor, which I suggest everyone who's founding a company get, someone that's just completely removed from everything you're doing, but knows what it's like to be a founder. And he was like, hey, have you guys talked about what you want your exit to be? And at the time, in my mind, I was like, why does that matter? We're so early. How could we be thinking about that? But it's actually very important. If you're both sitting there and one of you wants to create a visionary company that's going to take over the world, and then you're going to be at the helm at for 40 years, and the other one's like, no, I'm trying to get to a certain number and then I'm out of here, that could get in the way when you're building product, when you're going to market, when you're getting offers in the future. So it's really, really important to be aligned on those things before you go out there and start spending years of your life together doing stuff. And so luckily for me and Kaylan, I immediately came downstairs. I remember I was at your place, Kaylan, and I immediately forced the conversation. I was like, hey, we've never talked about this, but what would be a successful thing for you if we were to do this, right? And we both came to a number that we agreed on. And it pretty much, I felt in the moment, and you can tell me what you think, I felt really good and I felt really good alignment because you get a lot of things thrown at you. So it's nice to be on the same page on things. And I think that, really guides a lot of the activity of what we do. And you make a lot of decisions around reinvesting in the business, revenue, and everything like that. So I think it's one of those critical things that you need to understand when you start the company.
Yeah, and I think that, we hadn't had the explicit discussion, but as I've mentioned before, if I was listening to you talk about how you wanted one of your sons to step into the executive role, they're toddlers and young children now, I would have absolutely gotten the sense that, oh, you're looking for a legacy business. This is something that you want to run like a family owned and operated generational pursuit. And we would have had that conversation immediately because that's not where I was, but it was advantageous to have the discussion anyway. And it's always reassuring to know that there is alignment. And I think one of the pieces of advice that I will offer is to not let hard discussions scare you because one, they have to be had anyway. But two, you may in fact feel incredibly supported and genuinely thrilled about the fact that you have more alignment than you realized, where you actually are on the same page and you're thinking about the future in the same way. You're looking out at a shared vision, and acknowledging that, having a discussion about it is incredibly powerful to now know that your teammate is on the exact same page, where I think we likely anticipate friction in so many of these realms that we tend to avoid hard conversations, or what you might have thought that was going to be a hard conversation, and it wasn't at all. It was 5 minutes. We picked a number and said that would be successful to me. Yeah. And we'll get into this later, but I I do think that sometimes people are looking at startups like they're one and done. And if you have an entrepreneurial spirit, thinking that you have to hit a home run on the first go is putting a lot of undue pressure on yourself. And so I think when you look at it like, well, what would I be happy having accomplished here and now with this product, project, service, whatever it is? And then maybe something interesting comes next. Life doesn't end at an exit. And so thinking about these outcomes in a way that's non-dispositive and is not your full career summary, right? Looking at this like saying, I'm going to be defined by this exit or non-exit, right? Again, if it becomes generational or if you IPO, you know, you've got to take the lens and expand the aperture a little bit to say, well, what else is there? And so these discussions are important, critically important, not just for the company's sake, but it's an interesting introspective exercise to do on yourself and say, am I trying to get rich and retire at 42, or am I interested in the exercise of building? In which case, you'll feel a lot less pressure on these types of conversations and yourself as you build your business.
So I'm going to add some really specific structure to those broad ideas. I'm going to break down this vision for the company into 3 broad categories: goals for the company, timeline for the company, and fundamentals and miscellaneous. These all bleed into each other, but for the purposes of this video, I'm breaking them apart into distinct categories. So 1, under goals for the company, there are broadly 4 kinds of companies: solve a specific problem, help a particular community, provide a service that you don't think others are providing correctly but already exists, and go down a well-trodden path where you're doing that same thing but better than others. And then 2, timeline for the company. If you accomplish all of your goals, which it's not going to go perfectly. So this is the ideal. Don't get attached to this ideal, but it's useful to have the ideal. 1, creating a unicorn that you want to crush the world and envision running for the next 10 to 30 years. Building a successful company and exiting in 3 to 7 years. And in that case, who would be your ideal buyer? 3, a successful mom and pop with 2 to 3 locations max where you maintain quality and it's very successful for those locations. Or 4, a local chainlet that has like 5 to 10 locations in your locale. And then 3, under fundamentals, you really need to look at 2 things. 1, ethical lines. Are there things you're not willing to do that your co-founder is willing to do in order to make the company succeed? Because what we're trying to avoid is 6 months down the road, your founder proposing something or doing something and you being horrified that they would even think that that's a good idea. Lastly, profits. Would you rather make an enormous amount of money, for example, $1 million a year, to do something mind-numbingly boring, like push the same button for 8 hours a day, every single day, or sit in a room and read a dictionary? Or would you rather do something that you find immensely satisfying and fulfilling, but you make far less money? Enough to support yourself, but not so much that you're making a crazy amount of money. And there is not a right answer to this question. But what is important is that you understand where your founder is coming from so you know what their goal is. Are they trying to find meaning in their work, or do they just want to make as much money as possible, regardless of how mind-numbingly boring it is? So Tyler and Kaylan, I would be interested to hear what your opinions are on answering this question.
Very easy answer. I just need a yacht that I can rent. I don't need to own it. Where my friends can come and land from a helicopter on the little helipad once in a while. I really do have a solid vision of what I would like my ideal life looks like. And it is still working on really exciting projects just from the ocean. And so to me, it will not, I don't care how much money beyond a functional point. And honestly, it doesn't take that much money to rent a yacht. So we're not getting crazy here. Like I said, I don't need to own it. there's not a very high bar that I seek to achieve. I love having a multifaceted and robust life. Money is not a very big factor for me. I spent a lot of time making a lot of it as a lawyer, and that was glorious. But I looked at that as affording me the freedom to now build something I care about. So to me, it was a means to freedom. And I think a lot of folks who, once they've got their basic needs covered, once they have the flexibility, I want the freedom to fly my friends somewhere, right? It doesn't have to be to Monaco on private jets, right? These are very, I think, tempered desires. I do know what I want my dream outcome to look like. I work toward that every day, but it will never be making as much money as humanly possible. I don't need to be Bezos. I don't care that much. So, I don't want to speak for Tyler and I'll turn it over to you, but I think we both have very aligned views on what success looks like. And as I've said before, understanding that you're not one and done, that this is not your only shot. When you start a company, it is not your only shot. You do not need a grand slam out of the gate. And if you enjoy building, you will continue building no matter what. And at a certain point, you're just amassing wealth. Good for you, right? But if you enjoy that process, there's more money to be made. You don't need to put that much pressure on your existing and immediate project. And I think that that takes a lot of tension out of mine and Tyler's relationship, because neither of us is looking at how do we manufacture the highest possible valuation, exit at the pico top, and then, go purchase a small landmass and buy a castle, right? Like, that's just not the objective. And that understanding where each other sits on that can really contribute to aligned outlooks.
So,
Yeah.
side note before Tyler answers, I wanted to mention along those lines, Kaylan, and we've talked about this before offline. Annie Duke wrote a book called Quit. And one of the things she mentions in that book is that the most successful founders are usually in their late 30s and early 40s and have founded a couple of businesses before that failed and didn't work. And the reason for that is that they need to learn what's not going to work and what is going to work and fail a couple of times before they get to the thing that they are determined to stick to and does work. So along just what you were saying of don't be attached to this one thing succeeding. I've had companies fail. I had a previous law firm that failed in spectacular fashion, and in a further episode, I will get into that in more detail. But I just wanted to follow on with what Kaylan is saying, is that there's actually scientific evidence to prove what she's saying. So Tyler, what about you? How do you think about profits?
On my end, I am very similar to Kaylan. I have started a family. I have kids. It is true what they say. When you have kids, all of a sudden your life no longer is your life. It is their life. And so a lot of what I do every single day is how can I set them up for a future that they can be, successful. I wouldn't say comfortable, because I don't think now doing this experience that you want someone to just live a comfortable life. You don't grow, you don't learn that way. But I want to be able to provide them with joys, provide them with teaching moments, like have the flexibility of time to really be able to, and I think that's the real luxury. I mean, if there's one thing money does, is it buys you time.
Absolutely.
And it's having that time to be able to have that impact on them in their lives. And that's really what I work towards every single day. And Kaylan, there's one point that I definitely want to carve back a little bit. And you talk about the current venture that you're in. It's going to absorb your life. You're going to be thinking about it all the time. But it is really valuable, and I don't think enough people talk about this, to think about what you do after. And it's a very hard thing to zoom out and do. But you hear countless stories of founders exiting and then having just this void inside of them because they were so defined by the company that they had built and grown. And then all of a sudden you get this nice fat check and it feels great from that standpoint. And then you wake up the next day or the next month and you're like, what do I do? Like, I used to have so much purpose. Everyone used to report to me. There was always something to be working towards. And now I just am at a loss of words. And people have talked about depression, which, you know, well, boo-hoo. Like, it's so hard to feel bad for you that you're sitting in all this money, but like, it is a real thing. And it just goes to show that, like, from my perspective, money is not everything. I actually think that purpose is everything. And money just happens to be something that gives you the freedom to go find your purpose. That is, sometimes you get lucky and it's aligned with what you're doing, right? But I think ultimately that is what many people are looking for is purpose, and money just happens to be a very prominent means to that end.
Well, it can also be a byproduct or a marker of objective success, right? If you want or desire to know that you're good at something you deem your purpose, making money can reaffirm that for you. If you believe you're solving a problem that needs to be solved, making money from that validates your time spent. And it is a trade-off for the time that you are not spending doing other things by acknowledging and understanding that you're on the right path. Or it's an external marker, right? It's an external marker. And this is all a very privileged conversation because we are not talking about covering your basic needs. We're talking about past a certain point when you have the luxury of deciding you're going to start a potentially venture-backed, potentially bootstrapped company. You are not forced into a situation by any means. And you are sort of staring at a blank canvas, deciding what to paint. The other thing I'll say is I'm reading a book called Master of Change by Brad Stolman that talks about this very need for flexible identity. And when your identity is completely wrapped up in a company, in a sport, being a professional athlete, being a lawyer, doesn't matter what it is, when that is your identity and there is little more to it, no matter what, anything that knocks you off of that course or shakes you a little bit is going to have such a monumental impact in a way that it would not otherwise had you other pursuits, other sources of value. Tyler, you are a great father, and the joy that you get from spending time with your children is differently validating than a company being successful. But if the company, heaven forbid, was not, you'll take pleasure and joy in knowing you're a great father, having hobbies, having friends that are like family. I think we often get wrapped up as founders in spending our every waking moment trying to make this thing successful so that we can go back to spending time with our friends and our family. But in that zone, you can really lose touch. And I genuinely believe it makes founders that much more fragile to be in a position where all they have is the company. Tyler, we both know people who have skipped family obligations, dropped off on their friends, have really gone MIA, and they believe that it's a noble pursuit, and maybe to them it is, but that identity becomes so fragile because when you have nothing else, if the company does not succeed in the way that you define success, you have set yourself up for failure, and you're going to be lost, and you're going to be the rudderless ship after you sell it. Even if you had a great exit, you are now searching for purpose again, and you have this very lost sense of identity. So tie a bow on it. Fully agree. And I think that's just sort of another side note about why it's important to keep a balance in your life to ensure we don't end up there.
So I actually wanted to tie back into that, and I was going to tie back into it. Thank you for saying that, Kaylan, because I was going to say about what Tyler was saying. One way to avoid that is to have passions and hobbies and interests while you're running the company. Look, I am extremely passionate about running my own law firm and making it successful and helping founders. But I also have other passions. For example, I love food and beverage. That's why most of my examples, you will notice in the following episodes, come from food and beverage, because that is one of my huge passions. I bake. I love making coffee. I love making cocktails. I can talk to you for 45 minutes about the different kinds of rum. I have no intention of starting a rum company or making money off of rum, but I can still tell you a lot about it. And that is one of the ways I stay, quote unquote, sane, is by being passionate about that kind of stuff. So I think that's really important that you have passions outside of your business that you deeply care about, that you can do and make you fully a full human besides just running your company.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think the scarcity mindset is one that limits many, many, many opportunities. And when you assume that there is abundance, I don't even say that to sound woo-woo about it, but when you operate out of abundance, knowing that you have other choices, other options, other opportunities, I think it enhances your decision making because you're not making it at low leverage. But also, it just puts you at ease. I spoke with somebody just today who made such a salient point that came out of nowhere, but he just said, nobody wants to work with anybody who's stressed. Investors don't. Nobody wants to work for you. Nobody wants to work with you. Nobody wants to partner with you. So the glorification of hustle porn and this mindset of just always be grinding and I shouldn't see you smiling. People comment all the time like, "Oh, Kaylan, seems like you're always out." I really? You see the highlight reel of when I'm out, right? That is a separate issue, but the point being, if you were a completely miserable human being that was nothing but tightly wound and you thought you deserved a medal for feeling sufficiently dedicated, I've got another story for you. And that's that genuinely you might get some investment. You might force or strong arm a couple of deals, but in the long haul, it's just not sustainable. And it doesn't work for you internally. And it really isn't going to work for your friends, family, or community. So
Totally. So let's move to another piece that's really, really important. And this cannot be understated. It's one thing to align on goals, but then you have to understand what role you'll be playing in the company and the type of person that you're about to, from proverbially, get in bed with, right? And this really touches on roles, talents, and responsibilities. And one story that I always like to tell people, and it plays out all over the place once you start looking for it. But there's really two archetypes that over time and data we've seen really are a great start to a company. One of the founders is a visionary. They are thinking 5 steps ahead. They're looking about how they're going to change the world. And I think to an extent, both founders have to be that way. But the other one is an operator that can take and kind of reel in the visionary founder and be like, okay, cool, come back here. We got to do these 10 things, and then keep them on the straight and narrow and make it happen, right? And I think that is, if you have two visionaries, you're not going anywhere. You're just going to have your head in the clouds the whole time. If you have two operators, you're only going to get as far as the next step in front of you, and which helps. And I would argue, actually, if you're going down a more traditional path like an agency or something like that, that can be really valuable. But if you're looking to create a product that's going to be solving an abstract problem or something like that, you're going to need a little bit more of that vision. And one of the best examples that I always talk about is at Apple. And so you have Steve Jobs, which everyone lauds over as this incredible visionary, brought the iPhone to fruition, famous in meetings saying, like, I don't care, the people don't know what they want, I know what they want. And you hate it, but he was always right, But he couldn't do that all by himself. And so he had Wozniak at first, and then he had Tim Cook when they really took off in the 90s and the early 2000s. And Cook has always been known as an incredible operator. So he's able to take the vision from Jobs, turn it into tangible things, and then be able to bring it to market. And so I always use that example because it's one that everybody knows and can relate to, but it applies to almost any business if you really think about it. And so that's something that I always talk to other founders when they're early in their journey. It's like, make sure you're not, putting two positive signs together, two negative signs together, because you're going to end up coming into struggles in and of itself that way too.
So just wanted to add a quick note about that. That is absolutely true, but I think it would be a mistake to think that one person is only the visionary and the other person is only the operator. Oftentimes in different areas, people like code switch into different rules. So while I absolutely agree that the visionary versus operator thing is true, I don't want you to think that one person must be the operator all the time and the other person must be the visionary.
David, you're right. And you've got these kind of roles, I think. And the question becomes then, how do you map that to actual org chart? So in particular, what I've come to learn is the CEO, which everyone always hears about the CEO, there's a reason for that. There's some very specific things that come with that title. And it could be either founder, the operator, or the visionary. I'm going to throw it over to our resident CEO here, Kaylan. Do you have a point of view on that, just as being the CEO of MAGNETIQ, and then also what you've observed in our relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have spent a lot of time working very collaboratively without outlining hard, specific roles and responsibilities. We've sort of fallen into a pattern that leans into our relative strengths. I have from day one had an idea of what nirvana looks like. I've had an idea of what in 5 years, 10 years, MAGNETIQ looks like and what the entire landscape shift has looked like. But on the day to day, I'm also very, very detailed, and I do a lot of the legal work from past experience and some of our really nitty gritty communications. But Tyler and I have a really good balance that we have fallen into. He is absolutely who moves the needle on objectives when we are setting roadmaps and saying, great, this is the next big push. How are we going to break it down and eat the proverbial elephant? Tyler is an exceptional operator. The element I think that you're referencing, Tyler, about being the CEO that involves much more than what the daily tasks are, is that it is everybody else's win, but it is my loss. I take responsibility at the end of the day for any PR hit, anything negative that happens, anything that goes wrong, any funding we didn't get, any client we lost, that is all on me. And I don't say that in a way that suggests you place it there. I just feel like it's my job as the CEO for the buck to stop here. So it is never going to be anybody's fault but mine. But when we are winning, we as a team, and I say this often, that we need to act and speak like a team for all things positive. We've built this, we've done this, and it's, to me, and again, you can let me know where you stand on it. Maybe today's the therapy session where we air it out, but I think that is something I bring to the table as looking at our relationship under a lens of what serves the greater good. And if I'm going to represent the company in this role, where are my sort of qualitative responsibilities alongside the quantitative ones? There are absolutely day-to-day tasks that I'm responsible for, lots of them, right? But it also means getting out and pitching a VC in an ice bath and finding any and every event that seems halfway relevant, making the calculations of whether or not it's going to be worth the time trade-off. There are a lot of sort of nondescript elements that come into vision setting. I wish I just woke up with a dream and said, here, Tyler, this is what I think it should look like. Have no feedback, no pushback, and just have somebody else set it into motion. That sounds like a dream, but it also wouldn't mean that we were co-founders. So we have a really interesting balance of who has the vision on what's next. I mean, I can tell you for the last few years, I know every next feature that's on Tyler's brain. And that is like a medium visionary step of within this giant goal landscape. You're right, David. There are places and times where you switch off, but Tyler has, grand visions of what the next feature implementation is going to be, why it matters, who's been asking for it, these sorts of data points where we each just have to get in line sometimes and say, I trust you, I trust your vision, and I trust the data that you've been pulling in. One thing I will add to you that I heard is a great anecdote from somebody else who was talking about changing their company name. They had a very, very large internal debate about changing their company name. They had to because they received cease and desist. So this was not like a for fun change. Turns out somebody else filed a trademark 24 hours before them. But a lot of context that was brought to the table was by who happened to be the CEO, but she said, I've been out in the field asking people. I've been talking to people, and they really resonate with this kind of kooky name. They really love the fact that it draws them in, and it's very different and unexpected. Whereas the other co-founder wanted something that was a little bit more palatable, if you will, or a little bit more luxurious or streamlined. It doesn't matter what it was, but you could understand where both were coming from. Branding is super important. But who is in the position to have better or more complete information on a certain topic? That's who I think should drive the car. And when one person has unique experience, whether it's because they've been in the trenches building with engineers, they're going to have better insights on what is and isn't feasible and why than somebody who's been out talking to clients who are filled with wish lists all day. These are very complementary skill sets, but also just information gathering positions. And we get better at those. We almost re-establish the grooves that we are in by virtue of the activities we conduct every day. So I'm getting better at taking in these sorts of information from techies, from VCs, from folks at conferences in the academic sphere. And Tyler has a completely different set of very unique data points that I don't have. And I, at the end of the day, trust where his expertise lies when mine is lacking. So that's a really, long-winded way of saying that the founder relationship has to be balanced, but somebody needs to be setting the vision and somebody else needs to be, driving the car toward that destination at the end of the day in very broad strokes.
The one thing I will say is that I have come to appreciate is, and you touched on it earlier, when you're the CEO, buck stops with you. Everything that happens to the company external is you have to be very attuned to it. And I think you are very attuned to it, Kaylan. And so I'm in the weeds more, just going, and sometimes I break stuff and everything like that. And so I will bring things forward that don't fit the taste, the profile, the vibe of what maybe needs to be put out externally. Or you're more sensitive to those things. And I used to get frustrated, but I understand now that it's like, since you are the one that it gets reflected back on, naturally you're going to be more protective. And that's a good thing to have, because that means that not only like it's an alignment between you and the company to make sure that it's there. And I'm kind of outing myself here, but I do think that, like you said, you're because of the nature of the things that you're doing, you're going to be having more blind spots that others don't, right? That's just the nature of it. And so I think that that is something that I've noticed and then I've grown to appreciate, whereas it used to frustrate me, right? As a co-founder, you should always be thinking about what the company is, because, it's your baby as well. But there are levels to it, right? And so that's what I've noticed about your time as CEO.
So a quick note about that. I also think it's important, not just within the founder relationship, but external sources to know what you need external help with. For instance, I am in the process of building my firm's website. And while I have opinions, I defer to the web developer on a lot of things because I'm not a web developer. Just like what Kaylan was saying, I haven't developed 100 different websites for 100 different companies. And if the web developer says, yes, but don't do that for these 5 very good reasons, they go, great, you're the web developer, I trust you. If you told me don't do this legally, I would look at them like they're insane because I'm the lawyer. They're not. But when it comes to web development, I don't know. If you say this is a terrible idea, I trust you, it's a terrible idea. So I think that's also not the same exact idea applies when you have a co-founder and when you are the single owner of a thing and are going to outside sources for the parts that you can't do. Because I am the only person running my law firm. I don't have a co-founder, but I don't know how to develop a website. So I hired somebody to do it for me, and I'm collaborating with them on how to develop
Tyler
it.
and I didn't know how either, and some part of it is just diving in and learning. But I mean, I hear you, and I think it's a very, very valid point. One thing I'll say about being a solo founder versus a team is that you do have freedom of choice in everything you do, but sometimes there's analysis paralysis, right? Which is to say that, like, okay, great, well, I have so much freedom that it gives me no direction. If I have strong opinions loosely held, which I tend to, I will present something to Tyler, and if he disagrees, I'm like, oh, okay, great. Then what would you prefer instead? And it is a nice redirect of, well, I trust you implicitly, and we've arrived there after many years now, but I trust you implicitly. If I really disagree, you will absolutely know, and we'll talk about why I feel strongly about it. But I think a lot of decisions are your best guess. So when you have somebody else to bounce them off of, if they agree, it's an immediate go. If they are neutral, you figure it out. And if they really disagree, you'll talk about it. And those are great signals to me to keep things moving. I think you can otherwise get stuck in a cycle of overthinking things, or, motion is the antidote to everything. Moving forward is always going to be the answer. And to me, it makes it easier to have somebody else there who, again, either validates the idea and off you go, or disagrees and you have a discussion about it. But no matter what, there is a sharpening of your direction. Because if I feel like we're both on the same page, we're going full steam ahead, and now there's nothing stopping us. And if there are any of the other two sort of neutral and or disagreement, we're going to have a discussion that illuminates many more things, but also potentially saves us from going in the wrong direction. So that's a benefit of having a co-founder can come with its own struggles of communication and working style and hours and families and trips and all sorts of things that you just have to deal with for two people instead of one. But it's incredibly helpful from the perspective of decision making if you feel fully aligned and that you have trust in your co-founder. It's an exceptional help. It's an accelerant.
So I'm in this really unique position of being both, because I run this channel with Tyler and Kaylan. And so we are more or less co-founders of this channel and agree on everything. But I also run my law firm on my own. So we have this really interesting combination of I have semi co-founders and not semi co-founders at the same time.
And where do you think that is similar, where I think we spend time talking about things that, with three people, it's interesting because there are things that if I am not pressed about something, I stay out of it because I don't need to fight to win on a point, and I trust you too. So if you guys feel strongly about it, whatever you settle on, I'm good with. If I have an opinion, you will absolutely hear about it. But most things I think just aren't that serious. Like so many things just aren't that serious. And so it can be difficult to manage with multiple people, but sometimes that's a braking system, but other times it's an accelerator because it's like, great, two people are aligned and I don't really have a dog in this fight, full steam ahead. But now you've got three hands at the wheel driving toward this same vision, and it can be a many hands makes light work situation.
And I think that's exactly how we've succeeded, because I was thinking about this earlier, and we're going to eventually do a whole episode on this, on what I am loosely calling the just do it perfectionist matrix, where what you're shooting for is somewhere in the middle, because just shooting from the hip is not going to get you a good result. The first thing that you come up with is not necessarily always the best thing. But then you get into, on the other extreme, decision paralysis. And so what you're kind of looking for is enough working through it and getting repetition to get a good result, but you want to make sure the thing gets out the door. And so you're always trying to find that middle ground between just do it and perfect. And it's helpful to have other people to be like, you're really overthinking this, just do it. Or maybe you should do another couple of drafts with this, because this isn't it. To wrap this all up from the legal perspective, this is the thing a lawyer can be extremely useful for. What you need after you have all of these difficult conversations is what's called a founder's agreement. It's basically a business prenup. You're going to take all of these ideas and put them into legal writing. So when conflict comes up in 6 months, a year and a half, you have it written down what you decided when you were calm, what the answer is. Nobody makes good decisions when they're upset. What you do is you make good decisions when you're calm and rational and see things objectively. That is the entire purpose of a founder's agreement. You're calm and rational and can see things clearly and will agree on a legally binding document about what the answer is. So in 6 months, a year and a half, when you're emotional, you can just refer back to what you previously agreed and you already have the answer. So now I think that's a good time to move on to our last topic, which we're only going to briefly touch on and do a further episode on fundraising. Tyler?
Yeah, so the big piece that we want to talk about fundraising here is in the context of agreement of the path you want to go with your co-founder. I say this because fundraising can be a very, very time-consuming exercise. It is a time-consuming exercise, and one of the things that you have a ticking clock on is the time to start the business. And so you've been hearing about a lot of people lately in the past couple of years talking about bootstrapping your company. You've also seen people in the AI world just like blasting off with like $1 billion checks and $1 billion valuations. And I think there's a lot of nuance to this. But the biggest thing that you need to understand is, what path do we want to go down? And you don't have to be bootstrapped forever, but what point do we want to actually get on this quote unquote funding roller coaster? Because once you do get on that funding roller coaster, there is a clock that immediately gets set. Because a lot of institutional investors have LPs or people that have invested in their funds, and they have return requirements that they need to do over time. And so it used to be this instinctual thing where it's like, I'm starting a tech company, of course I have to go and raise funding, right? I don't think that's the case today with all the tech that we've seen and the efficiency and innovation that's come through, but it still is a very, very important decision. And me and Kaylan can attest, like fundraising, there are weeks that we took entire weeks just working on our story, working with consultants and figuring out how do you go to market and make those connections. When you look back on those times, and I don't know how you feel, Kaylan, but it's like, man, if we had taken those 3 weeks and just talked to clients and brought revenue in the door, like what could that have done for the business and where could we have been now, right? And so it is a trade-off. It is something that you should be having a serious conversation about, and there are levels to it, right? So Kaylan, I know that you've been in this trench with me. Any comments from you? Because I know as the CEO, you're also doing a lot of the face of that fundraise and feeling a lot of that that time and that pain.
Yeah, I think a few things. One is that I've also seen fundraising from the legal perspective. So I see the ins and outs of it. And that is both a blessing and a curse, because you see some things and understand some things about fundraising. And we will talk about this in a broader episode that can be very frustrating. But some of our finest moments came from nose to the grindstone, really refining our story. And as we say very frequently, it was worth the exercise. We've done a lot of things that did not immediately bear fruit. A lot, right? We've wasted a lot of time that we didn't think we were wasting. We didn't look at it at that point as though it was going to be a waste, but we look back and say, oh my God, I can't believe we did that. Fine. But it's something that's very important to refining your story. And if you are doing something new that is difficult to articulate, that is an exercise worth undertaking. Starting a new bakery, you're starting a bakery. People understand what that is. You'll have your own nuances. You'll have your special items. You'll have your twist on it. But people know what a bakery is. Tech is unique in the sense that there's a lot of novelty to it. And sometimes we're pulling things out of thin air to try to describe something that people can't put a picture to in their mind. And a lot of our fundraising journey supported the refinement of that story. So was it worth it for that perspective? Absolutely. However, it is an incredibly challenging time during very choppy markets. When we were going out initially, we were in one of the worst fundraising cycles in recent history. And it was like, well, no wonder this is frustrating. And we feel like we're banging on, vacant doors. And that ends up being potentially demoralizing. So I will say that I think there's another aspect to consider is I feel like I eat no's for breakfast, and I am good with that. If you have any sort of fragile ego, fundraising is going to be difficult. You are going to need to gird the proverbial loins, because unless you are in a very hot industry, in a very hot cycle where people are just copycatting writing checks because A16Z dumped a bunch into the newest AI-powered cat collar, then you are going to have to prepare yourself for so much rejection. And if that's something you don't take well, start figuring that out now. And then the last thing I'll say is, although we've touched on a fair number of topics, fundraising is a unique one because it's both logistical and emotional. it can feel like the validation of your idea is not happening just because somebody hasn't written you a check. And that doesn't mean that there's not room in the market for you. And there can feel like emotional dissatisfaction with some external forces that have the potential to bleed over into your founder relationship, to people's family situations. Money is no joke when it comes to people who have to support themselves, right? We didn't come into this with the luxury of having just, trust funds sitting behind us. We both worked very hard. And as I mentioned earlier, bought ourselves the freedom to try something new. But that runway isn't infinite. So when you're dealing with things that could be potentially difficult discussions, I think anything that affects your co-founder's livelihood, their money, their family, or their relationships is going to affect your founder relationship. So best to get it on the table early before you look back in real regret about wishing that you had the discussion earlier, wishing that you ironed things out. Sometimes we like to operate blindly and we ignore the red flags. People do this in regular romantic relationships too. You want so badly for this thing to work that you're willing to ignore signs of distress along the way. My biggest takeaway from this episode is for people to please think about the things that are the stickiest, the ugliest, the most difficult, and put them on the table first. Eat the frog first, right? And then, and only then, once you've established at least moderate compatibility, there are things that you can negotiate. But once you've established baseline compatibility, then start moving forward together as a team. Otherwise, this is the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
100%. That is my entire legal philosophy, is the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And the entire reason I am in this area of the law, I could be in the litigation area, which is the pound of cure area, and make a good living, but that is just fighting. And I wanted to help people prevent those problems before they happen, so that when those problems do arise, they are in much better shape and it is much less painful.
Yeah. And I think we would rather be sitting in your office, David, having the discussion about what do your equity splits look like than we would be happy to be in your office later saying, we've got to unwind this whole thing and it's gotten contentious and we hate each other. It's like divorce proceedings. It can get, depending on where you are in your cycle, it can get just as ugly, if not worse. So, there is glowing reason to sit down with a lawyer, sit down with an advisor, have these discussions early on, have your neutral third party asking the hard questions so that nobody feels like they're projecting the what ifs or why are you asking me that or why? What do you think I'm going to do about this? Da, 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 da. Having a neutral third party be part of these discussions early on is one of the most proactive and preventative measures you can take. And although it sounds like what you really want to get to doing is just building, coding, building, manufacturing, whatever it's going to be, you really want to sprint into starting that. Back it up, take a pause, start here first. Talk to a lawyer. And that's not a shill for you, David, although we've got the perfect resource. But my point is you can really stave off a lot of heartache if you have the hard conversations up front. That is universally applicable, but founders, I think, are the ones who think about it the least, frankly. It's two people coming together from different backgrounds. They don't feel like they have to be romantically compatible, of course they don't, but they don't think about the fact that an emotional relationship still leverages a lot of the hard parts of a marriage, which is why we call this the founder marriage.
And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up on Kaylan tying everything in a neat bow. Thanks for speaking with us, watching this week, and we hope you've enjoyed this video, and we will see you next week on Insufferable Experts.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.